This evening, our panel will be introduced quite appropriately by a gentleman who is known to all of you, I think, by reputation at least, Mr. Reg Murphy, who is the publisher of the Baltimore Sun. Mr. Murphy.
Thank you very much. The Sun takes some great pride in presenting this panel on an annual basis. I also take great pride in having Charlie Cordry here on the right. He sits there for political reasons, and if you haven't figured that out by now, I can't help you. Charlie's the closest thing we've got to a household word. I suppose he probably is the most famous of the Baltimore Sun writers since Mencken. We often say that Charlie knows more about the Pentagon than the Secretaries of Defense. That's not a particularly high compliment. Almost daily, he shares some knowledge with readers of the Sun. A couple of weeks ago, in one of those front-page exclusives that you have come to expect of him, he told about the internal struggle on the Packard Commission on Defense Reorganization. It was a struggle over how candid its report could be without inflicting political damage on an already wounded Pentagon bureaucracy. A few days later, and I took some pride in this because I thought it was one of the things we should have done first, he was back with an assessment of the Philippine Army, and still later with a look at how important the Clark and Subic Bay installations and other American bases in the Philippines are to our defense system. And he'll be talking a little bit about that. You probably know, if you've read the op-ed page of the Baltimore Sun, that Steve Browning was the founder and for 8 years the editor of the op-ed page, the page which I believe to be the best op-ed page in the United States, and Steve gets the credit for that. Now he's our diplomatic correspondent, and you're beginning to see some work that I take great pride in as well. In the last couple of weeks, his stories have put into the sharpest focus the division which existed within the U.S. government on Philippines policy, a division which ranged the President's Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, against some unusual allies, the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Pentagon. In Tuesday's paper, Mr. Browning had the only story that I saw and that anybody else has shown me, which reported why the White House went public with its appeal to Marcos to quit. Not as a message to Marcos, who had already gotten that word privately, but as a signal to military elements still loyal to Marcos that the United States government had withdrawn its support from the Marcos government. The program will be moderated by Joe Stern, who, as everybody in this room knows, is the editor of the editorial page of the Sun, who I think also has shown some prescience in the last few days. And I just want to read you the last paragraph of the editorial which appeared yesterday morning, which said, the headline said, Marcos, go in, ... The last paragraph of that was written more on deadline than any of you can believe. Listen to it. If Mr. Marcos leaves office, the United States may have to grant him asylum as the only means of averting a bloodbath. If this should be the case, it would require the overt approval of Mrs. Aquino, who thereby might have to lay aside her plans to try Mr. Marcos for the murder of her husband, Mr. Aquino. Clearly, the post-Marcos era will pose challenges, but none so crucial as the need to get rid of a repulsive tyrant who tries to identify with a nation that has rejected him. Within about 3 or 4 hours after that, we all were looking at the stories that confirmed exactly what that paragraph said. Obviously, from what I've just said, I take great pride in being associated with people like this. I'm delighted to see that this is a room full of people who also, I know from some from personal experience and some from reputation, are also interested in the kinds of coverage that the Sun has been able to afford this community over a period of time. And we're delighted to have you. Joe, it's your show.
This is our 6th appearance before this group. We started with the Reagan era. We're still in the Reagan era, and it will be our purpose to assess the foreign policy of this country and to try to give some reading on where we are going, where we have been. This has been quite a year since we last met. We have had the beginnings of the disintegration of the apartheid regime in South Africa. We have just recently seen 2 tyrants overthrown in 2 different parts of the world. We have seen oil prices plunge and change the entire economic picture in the world. We have seen the summit between a brand new Soviet leader and a president who showed himself quite capable of dealing at the summit in a most capable way. We have seen tremendous reforms in China. I could go on and on with all the things that have occurred. Instead, I will be quiet for a moment anyway, and turn the panel first over to Charles Cordry, who is going to assess the military picture. Charlie, of course, is the Dean of the Pentagon Press Corps. After he speaks, I will introduce the novice of the State Department Press Corps, Steve Broning, who has moved in like a cyclone and done very well in his very first 4 or 5 weeks there. So Charlie, you lead off, then Steve, and then I'll pick up a few pieces. And in accordance with our long-standing policy, we will try to limit our remarks so that there can be good dialogue, which I think is what everybody wants. Go ahead.
Thanks, Joe. Hello again to everyone. You're really gluttons for punishment 6 times now. Since our last conclave, there have been a lot of developments that might not seem necessarily to be connected, but which I'd like to tick off a bit tonight, because I think that from the point of view of defense, which undergirds the foreign policy you'll hear about in a few moments, we are at a quite critical period. Now consider, since January 9, 1985, you've had a fairly rapid acceleration of the President's Star Wars program, the research into whether we can defend against ballistic missiles. And at the far end of the spectrum, we've had an increase in terrorism, as exemplified in the TWA airliner, the shootings in Rome and Vienna, and the capture of the ship in the Mediterranean. You've had questions raised about whether we've got our money's worth. We've spent $1 trillion on defense during the Reagan administration. We little note that we've also spent a couple of trillion on other things. We've had investigations and penalties and charges. We've had moves toward reform of the defense system. We've had the Graham-Rudman law, which threatens to be cataclysmic for defense as well as for everything else. Just threatens to, though. Somehow these things solve themselves in the end. And we've had the summit on pointing the way to possibilities for arms control. Now, what have all these things to do with each other? I think that some of these items mean that the huge military buildup, if not over, is certainly on a high plateau where it will stay, probably not go much higher. That means that the administration, and in particular its Secretary of Defense, ought to begin to establish some priorities on what we're going to do with defense money, which will not be as plentiful. And I don't see signs at this point that they are doing that. The Graham-Rudman law and even Congress's unwillingness to continue the build-up without Graham-Rudman will indeed force priorities just the same, and you'll begin to get distortions. You'll have to ask, do you want Star Wars or do you want to combat terrorism? Or can you do both, and if so, to what extent? I think that what I'm trying to tell you is that it's my perception that something is very wrong with present defense organization and structure, but I'm not quite sure that we want to be as harsh as some of us may be tempted to be. Consider that the Defense Department puts out about 56,000 contracts a day. And if it doesn't have a mistake on occasion, if we don't get a horror story on occasion, then's when one should be surprised. And also consider that for every $1 billion worth of contracting done, probably hundreds, if not thousands of people get into the decision-making process. The Office of Management and Budget, the Defense Department itself, the Military Services, the General Accounting Office, 6 committees of Congress. There's no end to the people who are influencing the spending of your money, and I think, in the end, causing everything to cost more. So we're going to have some reorganization, and I happened to stumble over a quote from Gaius Petronius, and you're going to be good enough not to ask me much about him. But in the year 66, he had this to say: "In life, we tend to meet any new situation by reorganizing, and a wonderful method it can be for creating the illusion of progress while producing inefficiency and demoralization." That was 66. In 1986, we'll see problems created through reorganization, which we'll have to solve in 1996. Now then, while all this is going on, the Reagan administration, and many will think correctly and many will not, will maintain that although it's going to lose its shirt on defense money, the threat to this country's interests in various parts of the world is not diminishing, and the Reagan administration would argue it's growing. That is a debatable point. But nevertheless, I think it's safe to say that there are some signs of improved Soviet behavior. And where I would like to conclude here at this point is that if there is a sign of improved Soviet behavior and a chance for American-Soviet relations to improve thereby, we have to ask ourselves how much we want to slow down the defense program and what prospects for arms control, how would they be affected by a slowdown. These are crucial issues that have to be debated and will be debated all this year, and I expect starting at 8 o'clock tonight when the President speaks.
Good evening. To follow up Charlie's presentation, I'd like to just go back to the beginning of the Reagan administration and point out that this administration came to office with a very few simple ideas in foreign policy. Primary, I think, was the notion that the Carter administration had wrongly displaced the Soviet-American rivalry from the center of our concerns. The Reagan administration believed that this rivalry would had determined, and should determine the conduct of our foreign policy around the world. It should be our prime concern. The second main idea of the Reagan administration was that through a policy of rearmament, of overcoming what the Reagan people thought was neglect under the Carter administration, that the Soviets would be constrained to return to the negotiating table in a serious way and perhaps to make concessions. There's a quote I ran across, an interview with President Reagan shortly after his inauguration, and he's talking about American industrial capacity and its strength. He says, "But they know our potential capacity industrially and they can't match it, so we've got the chip this time. That if we show them the will and determination to go forward with a military buildup in our own defense and the defense of our allies, they then have to weigh, do they want to meet us realistically on a program of disarmament, or do they want to face a legitimate arms race in which we're racing? We could go forward with an arms race and they can't keep up." As with most things of life, the Reagan administration was partly right and partly wrong. The Soviet-American rivalry is inescapably at the center of our foreign policy, but as I find, does not determine the development of crises everywhere in the world. We have only to look around us in the last few weeks. The foreign policy crises that have preoccupied the attention of the White House and the State Department, the National Security Council, CIA, and the Defense Department had nothing to do with the East-West rivalry. It occurred in a former colony of the United States, the Philippines. Partly right. The Reagan administration, as Charlie suggested, through its accelerated arms buildup, its $1 trillion defense program probably has forced the Soviets back to the negotiating table, and is probably responsible as anything else for Gorbachev's January 15th global disarmament proposal, which contains elements of some interest, I believe, to arms control negotiators. So with that, I would like to conclude and get on with the questions.
I would like to make a few comments about the president, because I feel that you read every day about what we have to think about the president, and we are unstinting in our criticism because we have a hair shirt role to play, I think, in the government of the United States, in assessing our federal government, our state government, and our city government. But I am struck by several things as we meet tonight, 6 years later, 6 years of Reagan's leadership, and that is that I do feel that he has accomplished more than any of his critics, including myself, expected that he would achieve. If you'll recall, one of the early issues of his administration was whether we were to deploy Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles in Europe. You'll recall that there were street demonstrations against this in Europe, that he was universally regarded as a cowboy, that his excessive rhetoric, and I still think it was excessive, unduly engendered a peace movement which could have endangered our policy. But the fact is that he was able to proceed with deployment, after which the Soviet Union walked out and stayed out for a considerable period of time, after which the Soviet Union came back and agreed to negotiate, after which the Soviet Union and the United States started moving towards the zero option that the president had proposed of eliminating intermediate-range nuclear weapons from Europe, after which the Europeans who had first asked us to deploy these weapons and then had deplored the deployment then became worried that these weapons might be withdrawn. That is what has happened. And what it means, I think, is that the president has set the arms control agenda far more than the Soviet Union has. And as my colleagues have suggested, this is and remains and will remain the central issue in American foreign policy. With that, I will terminate, because I think, as I said before, that this is a dialogue more than a trialogue, so let's go at it. The question was, are we on the threshold of an era of growing democracy around the world, or are these merely precursors of dictatorship? Go ahead.
There are two schools of thought about this, I find, in the State Department. Spokesmen for the administration are eager to take credit for the move toward democracy in this hemisphere, leaving, I believe, right now, according to the State Department's definition, only Paraguay, Chile, and Nicaragua as non-democratic governments. To the extent the administration has encouraged this trend, should probably be applauded. There's another school of thought which says that these things are cyclical, that one is reminded, for example, of Voltaire's comment when Napoleon was in power that you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. So that after years of military rule, say in Argentina, of misrule in Argentina, and years of military rule and misrule in Brazil, and other places in South America, the problems that were postponed or created or exacerbated led to the discrediting of these regimes, and therefore a trend toward democracy, according to this theory. Now, whether or not the regimes that succeed them can do better will determine probably their length of life. Well, one would like to think, I suppose, that this is a trend toward democracy, a historical force over which men have not so much control. But the question is not been answered to my satisfaction.
May I just say one thing on that issue as well? It seems to me that the events of this year, perhaps more than any year in recent memory, might lead us to conclude that democracy is not a monopoly of the Western European civilization and instinct and gene pool. That democracy seems to be an infectious disease, a very benign disease that is at the heart of the human experience in a lot of parts of the world. The other aspect of this, of course, is whether this trend can continue unless the world also deals with the tremendous economic problems that crush freedom quite often more effectively than political repression.
The question was, is the Soviet Union ready to accept on-site inspection to ensure compliance with the terms of an arms control agreement? Is that a fair representation of the question? I think that the evidence is yet to come in. If they are, Mr. Gorbachev has spoken more favorably of it, perhaps, than others have. But let me say a little bit more about arms control than that, if I might. And what you say is, of course, true, that for 25 years or whatever the number is, we've been messing around with this thing, and we have come to a number of agreements which codified the arms race and let each side do exactly what it wanted to do. Therefore, the growth of nuclear weapons has paralleled the growth of arms control, both as an academic industry and as in terms of agreements. But I think that our people sense now, and I think Gorbachev gives some evidence of it, that perhaps it would be a good idea if we turn this thing back. I don't take a great deal of comfort from that. It seems to me, if it's true that there are 50,000 nuclear weapons in the world and we agree to cut 50%, we still have an awful lot of overkill left, so don't get enthusiastic about it, but it would be a great political sign. So now then the question is, if they agree to deep reductions in nuclear weapons, it will take years to reach such an agreement, would the parties be willing to permit on-site inspection to see that it was being carried out? I think that the Russians must ultimately come to that if they want an arms control agreement. And I think it's as simple as that, and I don't think we will sign one that we can't somehow verify, and to verify becomes very difficult for the kinds of weapons that exist now, unless you can go out and screw the lid off and count them. I didn't give you much of an answer, did I?
The question is whether the United States has a right to superimpose its views on the Contadora governments of Latin America and continue seeking the overthrow of the government in Nicaragua.
Was the question, do we have the right? Is that what I understand it to be?
What is our overwhelming strategic interest for us to superimpose our judgment on the countries that are like the area?
In the judgment of the administration, I believe, any implantation of a Cuban-style communist government in this hemisphere is unacceptable. It's doubly unacceptable for Reagan administration planners because Nicaragua is in the isthmus in which the Panama Canal is found. Are you asking me my assessment of whether or not I think there's an overwhelming strategic interest? I think it is in the interest of the United States to try and prevent the consolidation of this regime. Whether it's as important as the Reagan administration says is a question of debate. The issue of Nicaragua and aid for the Contras is going to become a lot more urgent in the coming weeks as the administration prepares to submit a proposal for, I believe, something in the neighborhood of $100 million in aid to the Contras, of which $70 million is supposed to be earmarked for military or lethal aid. I believe as it stands now, we're giving them with something like on the order of $27 million in so-called humanitarian aid. Whether or not this will pass Congress is another question. Representative Barnes, who heads the Latin American subcommittee in the House, doubts very much that it will pass and that the administration will come back later with a much more modest proposal.
I would like to say that the Nicaragua issue, I think, highlights what might be described as the Reagan doctrine, which is a reversal of the Khrushchev Wars of Liberation doctrine, and it asserts that the United States has the ability to at least exert pressure or support wars of liberation against dictatorial communist regimes, as seen in the eyes of Washington. I also think, however, that Nicaragua is a wonderful example of the style of this president. This president came into office vowing to resist Nicaragua, coming very close to saying he wanted to overthrow it. I think in the past 6 years, he has confounded many critics who were warning periodically, at least a couple of years ago, that he was about to invade. I think it's the style of this president to keep the Sandinista government on the defensive, to harass the Sandinista government in order, if for no other reason, but to strengthen the Duarte government in El Salvador. But I don't think this president ever really intends to seek the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government by the use of U.S. troops. Nor am I convinced that he really seeks to overthrow it by the Contras. I think he wants to keep that government on the defensive. Now, whether he's going to be successful or not, I don't know, but I do think it does exemplify his style. And I think the downside of this policy is not so much our relationship with Nicaragua or whether we have a hostile but harassed regime in Managua. The downside of it is whether this policy alienates a good deal of Latin America. If you believe the public statements of these Latin American governments, you would have to believe that it does have a definite downside and it is alienating these governments. I am not sure if you would come to the same conclusion if you heard all their private assessments.
I'm tempted to prolong this discussion with a few short remarks, Joe. I get from my colleague Joe Stern an impression that the President of the United States is a stubborn fellow with a few fixed sets of ideas, and he doesn't let them blow around in the wind just because the winds may be changing. And I agree with that. And in particular on this one, I think that the Reagan administration has done a reasonably good job of penning up the Nicaraguan regime at this point. As to the strategic interest in the Caribbean Sea, we haven't mentioned and should that the real concern has a great deal to do with Mexico. That's the country that we don't want to follow in the Nicaraguan path. And the amount of American trade that goes out of Gulf ports to Europe and that would go there in the event of war is rather stupendous, although I don't have the figures at hand. The transfer of oil from the west to the east coast through the Panama Canal is a very important factor, as well as Steve's alluded to the canal. So all in all, I agree with Joe that we would not invade Nicaragua. I'm not even sure that the American military is a very obedient bunch, but I'm not sure that they'd want to go along on that expedition. They don't see any profit in it at all. But I do agree with Steve that the Reagan administration, I think no administration, would countenance the establishment of a communist regime on the North American mainland. And I think that was implicit in actions that Carter was taking before he left.
The question was asking Mr. Cordry especially to respond to a Flora Lewis column asserting that the Reagan administration has turned U.S. nuclear policy on its head by first demanding on-site inspection and then switching away from it and pursuing the arms buildup when the Soviets seemed amenable to this idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, but there was a final point, which is the only one I want to deal with, and I've forgotten what that was. Let's take first the question about whether the United States wants to continue testing nuclear weapons, which I think was part of the main issue there. And the short answer is yes, indeed, the United States does want to continue testing a form of nuclear weapons, and therefore does not accept Gorbachev's proposal, if it is a proposal, for a comprehensive test ban. Gorbachev, if nothing else, is smart in public relations, and his timing was good, so he got a lot of house with that proposal. First of all, as long as you have nuclear weapons, you're probably going to have to test some things to make sure that they work and that you can make improvements. Improvements are not always necessarily things that make war worse. I mean, it's hard to make war worse than the kinds of nuclear weapons that already exist. But the testing that is important to this administration is the testing of something called the X-ray laser, which is not like a hydrogen bomb or an atomic fission bomb. It is called a third-generation nuclear weapon. An X-ray laser is a hydrogen bomb that goes off in space and points its beams at enemy missiles so that it burns them up. And Edward Teller says we can do this. And if we can do this, then it'll be an element of Star Wars, which, as you know, your president tells you is a non-nuclear defense system. But he also says, press on with this just in case we find it'll work. It is not an offensive nuclear weapon, but it is a nuclear weapon, and it is to be tested, has been tested underground, and I can't imagine this administration would agree to a comprehensive nuclear test ban until it knows whether it can do an X-ray laser. It's important to know whether you can do that, because if the Soviets do it to you, they might blank out everything you've got, and that'd be nice to know what the effects of an X-ray laser would be. So that's just one aspect of it. But in all the rest, I don't think we're standing on our heads at all. And I'd rather read Flora's whole piece before I comment further. I will say to you something that Flora Lewis probably wouldn't. In the late 1940s, we were competing correspondents on the Latin American beat. But I don't think Flora would want to admit that.
The question is whether the extreme socialism being practiced by President Duarte in El Salvador is wrecking the Salvadoran economy
and chances for establishing democracy,
and undercutting the prospects of establishing a more firm democracy in El Salvador.
I wish I had a terrific answer for you, but I don't. I'm going to Central America in the next couple of weeks. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me recommence. I'm unable to give you a satisfactory answer to that question now. I think in a couple of weeks after I've visited there, I will be able to. But I wonder, in the circumstances, if what you described as extreme socialization of Duarte's economic policy is a cause of instability. If it is, I think it's probably a minor one, given the underlying instability of the regime, the civil war that's been raging there, and other social and political factors. So Joe is no doubt more qualified to answer this than I am.
Well, I can only say this. I did visit El Salvador about 3 or 4 years ago, and I was assured by many members of the loyal opposition in El Salvador, as contrasted to the disloyal opposition, that President Duarte was a communist, and a front for the communists and a dupe of the communists. When you look at his role in the very torn social structure of that country, where you have a communist insurgency tearing it on one side, and you have an oligarchical social structure which is resisting the loss of its economic powers on the other, and you see this fellow trying to pursue a middle way and to somehow come up with a kind of government that will satisfy enough public aspiration so that you could have some kind of a stable regime. I must say I did leave with a great deal of sympathy for President Duarte. The question is, why did the Reagan administration turn away from its policy of quiet diplomacy to pursue a very public form of diplomacy during the Philippines crisis? Steve, I think this is...
Yes, I think the answer, the short answer to that is that events outran policy. The policy of quiet diplomacy was no longer applicable, and that things were out of hand, and the administration had to use what tools it thought it had to use to restore the situation and to protect American interests, which include the bases, and which also include, as part of preserving access to the bases, the establishment, if not the preservation, of a regime based on popular sovereignty, one whose leaders would undertake long overdue economic, political, and military reforms. Quiet diplomacy no longer worked, so the administration felt it had to go public. And as far as Secretary Schultz's statement to the Budget Committee that our concerns for democracy in the Philippines ought to take precedence over our concerns for the bases should not be taken literally.
The question is whether the policy of public diplomacy on behalf of democratic forces can be applied in Korea as it has been in the Philippines. Again, Steve, I think this is yours.
I would guess probably not. If our assessment of events is correct, and that only when events outran policy was the administration constrained to go public on this. And I would guess that the administration would not, in the case of Korea or Indonesia or any other country in Asia right now. It was extremely critical, if you remember, of this sort of public diplomacy under the Carter administration of bringing friends and unfriendly countries under the close scrutiny and on the questions of human rights and democratic government. The administration came to power, pledged not to do this, and if it did, it was the circumstances which required them to do so, or made them feel that they were required to do so.
For the record, I think we also should note that the State Department did denounce the wave of house arrests in South Korea, and it urged the South Korean government to act in a democratic way.
We don't want to overlook, I think, and I'm sure we're not, that the Filipinos did some of this themselves. I think we ought to bear that very much in mind.
Excuse me, if I can make one follow-up comment that occurred to me, and I'm rather slow-witted, but one of the reasons, if American public diplomacy was successful in the Philippines, one of the reasons that it may have been successful, or successful as a contributing factor in encouraging the very strong Philippine forces that were already at play, is because among all the countries in Asia, the United States, Philippines is probably more susceptible to American influence than any other because of our long association with them. The fact that it was our only colony, and Filipinos look to the United States for many things, including institutions and counsel.
The question was, could we assess the SDI program, the Star Wars program, and how it will affect U.S.-Soviet relations?
One thing I think I can assure you, it's not going to happen on our watch, maybe our grandchildren's. And that's why it's such an interesting subject. It is discussed as if it were here now, and so in political terms, it's having its impact. We don't know whether we can do it. Nobody knows whether we can do it, but several people think we might be able to. I think it's. I think that it is. I should say what it is, and that is a system envisioned to be so good that it could stop a sufficient number of missiles that no one would dare to launch them in the first place. Now, it has had, I think, can't prove it, but I think it's had a tremendous impact on Soviet-American relations. I think it has scared the Russians to death. And that's not a wholly bad thing. It may or may not have been what brought them back to the table after they walked out. Some people would think that it was a change in sentiment in Europe that helped to bring them back. They walked out on negotiations having to do with European missiles, thinking that the Europeans would react in different ways from the ones they did. They got nowhere, and so they came back. But I think they're scared, and I think they're scared for the following reason. Whether we ever have Star Wars, we have got going a research project, a project having to do with high technology in its truest sense, such as there's never been. And the spin-offs are going to be fantastic. And this is why the Europeans are wanting to get on board one way or another, and I think the Japanese in time will. Anybody who's not on the Star Wars or on Star Trek is going to be left behind, no matter whether you ever have the Star Wars defense or not. Now, I think that Gorbachev sees this as rather interfering with any plans he might have for improving the lot of the Soviet Union. Just as he's almost caught up and can turn his attention, I'm dreaming now, but and can turn his attention to some kind of internal development. Here comes the United States with a whole new era of technology he's got to worry about and spend himself blind trying to keep even with. I truly believe that this is, some of what I say is right. And so that's how I see the impact on Soviet-American relations. I don't think for one moment that as long as Reagan is president, the United States will give an inch on Star Wars. And I think Mr. Reagan and Mr. Weinberger intend to have it so deeply embedded in this nation's economy that by the time they leave, nobody else could turn it back.
The question is, how do we equate the use of the word freedom fighter for the Contras fighting the Sandinista regime with our refusal to use the word freedom fighters to describe the African National Congress, which is the primary group fighting the apartheid government in South Africa. I would say that that the administration's policies in Southern Africa are probably more subtle than that question suggests. I think that that the administration has been trying somehow to erect some kind of a foundation or a network of peace in that area, and I think it's one of the failed policies of this administration. And I think one of the reasons it has failed is because too long it tried to follow a policy of quiet diplomacy in criticizing the apartheid government before it took a more public stance against apartheid, and a public stance that I think is more comfortable with the American people. The use of the word freedom fighters is just something that the president of the moment applies to forces that he happens to like. If they're on his side, they're freedom fighters. If they're not on his side, they are terrorists or guerrilla forces. This is a propaganda technique not unknown to our friends in the Soviet Union as well. I think what we should do as citizens is to realize that all of these situations, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or Nicaragua or Cambodia or Angola or South Africa, are very different, and that our government has to follow different policies in each of these places. The question is whether the increasing debt in African countries will militate against any kind of a democratic system, whether it condemns many of these third world countries to undemocratic regimes. I would say that there's a great deal of validity in that statement. But I would also say that the falling price of oil that you mentioned helps a great many more third world countries than it hurts. One of the reasons that many third world countries are in trouble today is because the world was held hostage by OPEC 10, 12 years ago. So I think that on the whole, the falling price of oil will be a boon to all African countries except Angola and Nigeria. The number of impacted oil exporting countries that are hurt by the price of oil is much more limited. We're talking about Algeria, we're talking about Nigeria, Iran, Venezuela, and Mexico. I think what our policy towards those countries must be is to give concessionary privileges to those countries that are important to us and that are friendly to us. And at the top of that list, of course, has to be Mexico. The question is whether amnesty for Marcos will allow him to keep his plunder and not be brought to justice, and what we should be doing about it. Steve, I think this is yours.
I think it's fair to observe that this is not a perfect world. And that perhaps as part of the bargain for gaining President Marcos' abdication and flight from his country, and what we hope will be the resultant stability, the price of giving him asylum here is probably not too great. It's not necessarily my judgment, it's just an observation. A few more observations. The United States has negotiated an extradition treaty with the Philippines, but has not yet been submitted to the Senate for ratification, so we, in effect, have no extradition agreement with the Philippines, should the present Filipino government discover evidence that would justify such a request. The second thing is that Representative Solars of New York, who is a very influential chairman of this House Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, is, I believe, prepared to introduce a bill in Congress in the coming days that would be directed primarily at the situation of whether or not the Marcos family misdirected U.S. or other funds, plundered his country, and used it for investment in the United States. I believe the objective of this bill, if it passed and it was declared legal, and if it found that the Marcos family had done this, would deprive them of these assets in the United States. So, on the one hand, on the other hand.
The question is, will there be a summit in 1986, and if so, what will be the agenda? I think that's in your category, Mr. Cordry.
That's diplomatic, huh? I think there will be a summit in 1986. I think Gorbachev says he's got to have some kind of an agreement on test bans or nuclear missiles in Europe. He insinuates as much. And the White House said today that there doesn't have to be anything to be signed, just got to have a meeting. And this is part of the preliminary sparring, and I simply think the two gentlemen are committed and that the world would be terribly let down if it doesn't happen. But I don't want you to go away with just my judgment on that. I want these other two to get on record, too.
I always follow my leader here, and of course there's going to be a summit this year, and I think Gorbachev needs a summit more than Reagan, and I think he needs it as part of his long process of establishing his power in the Soviet Union and dealing with his rivals. I think an enormous sense of disappointment would be evident in the Soviet Union if he did not pursue it. But I think when you're dealing with the Russians, and I think we ought to ask my friend Nicholas Turkachenko this question when he appears in a couple of weeks, the Russians will always go through this kind of sparring. I think it's just the way they do business, and quite often it's the way we do business.
I would just like to add one thing, that only if the Soviet leadership concludes that in the long term there is no prospect for any agreement or any cooperation with the United States would it dare call off the summit this year.
What will or should become of our bases in the Philippines? I guess this is for both of my colleagues.
Charlie? Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, I think we'll keep the bases. I think that their economic importance to the Philippines is easily recognizable to the Philippines. There, a considerable fraction of the gross national product goes in from those bases, maybe $300 million a year. This is what the sailors and the transients and the dependents and the employees and all the rest do. That's on top of our aid to the Philippines. The bases are really the only ones the United States has left in Southeast Asia, and they are extremely important. They're really the crossroads of the Pacific and the entrance into the Indian Ocean, and for the Navy, they're virtually irreplaceable. The Navy could go to Guam and spend a few $1 billion, and it'd be 1,600 miles from the scene, and really, the American position in the Western Pacific sort of anchored on those bases. The Air Force base is a little less clear-cut, but still important. So I think that sometime between now and 1991 that President Aquino will say, we've got to talk, and we'll talk, and maybe they'll get more of what they call rent. We have rights to the bases. Were they in perpetuity, Steve, or were they, well, anyway, till 1991?
1991.
But I mean, I'm not sure how the original deal went, except that it's been modified so that the Filipinos can have an appearance of sovereignty over their own territory and can get some income. But I think we stay.
Oh, excuse me, if I could just add something. It's my recollection that the agreement expires in 1991 but can continue until perpetuity unless one side or the other renounces it and gives a year's notice. In the meantime, there's a review of the base agreement in 1988 which has to do with the terms of our aid to the Philippines, which is tied to the bases. As it stands now, the United States is committed, the President is committed under the agreement to make what's in the language, to make his best effort to provide over the 5-year period of the review something on the order of $900 million. 800 million, is 8 or 900 million? 900 million dollars, so which amounts to about $180 million a year. This will probably, under the circumstances, be reviewed and revised upward when this comes up in 1988. Excuse me, one last question. That is an observation that I think is probably relevant, that at the start of her campaign, presidential campaign in the Philippines, Mrs. Aquino appeared less hospitable to the bases than she does now. She has now appointed her running mate as foreign minister, a move which State Department officials tell me is encouraging because he is committed to having the bases there.
I'd just like to make one other observation on this, and that is that in spite of President Papandreou's anti-American rhetoric over many, many years, our bases are still in Greece. The question is, how is the State Department handling the Afghanistan issue? And the speaker noted that Mr. Gorbachev yesterday in his speech to the Soviet Party Congress described Afghanistan as a bleeding wound, which I think is a phrase we will long remember.
If I could ask just one part and ask Charlie to answer the second part, which has to do with American military aid to the Afghan resistance. This is one of these issues where, mercifully, in my view, the United States is not directly involved. There are what are called proximity negotiations going on in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations. The negotiations involve the Kabul regime and that of Pakistan. It's called proximity negotiations because the parties do not sit in the same room. They sit in separate rooms, and the UN delegate goes back and forth carrying their proposals. The Soviets in recent weeks have made signals, only strengthened by Gorbachev's reference to this as a bleeding wound, that they are approaching the point where they might be willing to settle. American diplomats involved with this issue tell me that the Soviets, in fact, have not come up with what was proposals that would satisfy the Pakistanis, first of all, and second of all, would satisfy the Afghan resistance. How we are involved in this more directly, I believe, is in providing or helping provide aid to the Afghan resistance via channels that I can only guess at.
That's all I could have said, that latter part. I assume the Muslim world's helping in Afghanistan and that it's getting the weapons from somewhere.